Hey everyone, welcome to the Won't Fix podcast. Today I'm talking to Jonathan Bellack, who runs a newsletter called Platformocracy. He's been doing that for almost a year. He and I worked together at Google, where we were part of the same leadership team working on a central group that worked on privacy, safety, and security. I ran the product team for the privacy and security parts, and he ran the product team for the safety part. So I'm really excited to talk to Jonathan. I think you'll enjoy the conversation as well. And as always, I look forward to your feedback. Thanks. Jonathan, it's good to see you, sir. It hasn't been that long since we chatted, has it?
No, we've caught up. We've kept up pretty well in the 3 years since we took exile from the Plex.
That's right. So as I mentioned, you and I worked together at Google. We're part of the same leadership team. And I think one of the things we're going to talk about is Platformocracy. So what you've been doing for the last, what is it? Has it been a year already?
Almost a year. It'll be a year, June 6th.
Oh, congrats. That's amazing.
Yeah, I'll have to buy it a cake.
Yeah, exactly. So what has writing this newsletter and hearing, I'm sure you've gotten great feedback from different people who've read it. Have you changed your mind about anything in the last year as you've been doing this?
It's a great question. And it really is the classic case of any overconfident, middle-aged man who wades into a topic that they know a little bit about is sort of being humbled by the amount of complexity out there and the number of people who have already thought deeply about these sorts of areas, not just in a technology world, but in sort of world historic terms. I think I've spent as much time reading old political science books and manifestos and trying to educate myself on theories of democracy as I have learning about the latest identity technology or how we're going to do zero knowledge proofs or what the latest legislation is going to be.
Yeah, I can imagine some of this was quite different than kinds of conversations you may have had at Google about some of these topics. So I'd be super curious. You talk a lot about participatory governance. And have you been involved in discussions about that, whether at Google or elsewhere? I think also we can talk a little bit about the Applied Social Media Lab at Harvard. That would be super interesting to talk about as well. But have you had any meaningful, productive conversations about that inside of the machine versus outside of the machine? Or is this something that, people don't really want to talk about too much?
I think it's almost a category problem in terms of whether it's even a relevant discussion in a commercial sense. And I don't want to particularly demonize any individual technology company, but more to point out the dominant metaphor for thinking about these community platforms, whether it's the meta platforms like Facebook and Instagram or YouTube or TikTok or Snapchat, or even ones that have multiple smaller communities within them like Discord or Reddit, is very much the sense that they are a business and they are entitled to run their business however they see fit. And someone's recourse, if they don't like that, is to go become a customer of another business, which is, of course, how capitalism works. And there's nothing wrong with that. I have an MBA. I'm a card-carrying, proud capitalist. I'm not saying we need to turn the means of production over to whatever. But the notion of what these organizations are is challenging to that model. You'll hear tech executives say it's just like if we were running a bar, we have the right to refuse services. As long as we're not violating anti-discrimination laws. We're a store. We're allowed to decide who we want to sell to and who we want to do business with. That misses the fact that these are also communities of humans, many of whom already had real-world relationships and chose to use these platforms to maintain them, or who built real-world relationships using the technology of these platforms. So when somebody says, it's the Facebook community, it's not the Facebook community. It's the community of people I went to college with who are choosing to use a Facebook group to stay in touch with each other. We don't belong to Facebook. And so I think that's the hard thing when you're trying to talk to people inside these companies is there hasn't really been a readiness to think of the community as having rights, standing, power, independent from the sole choice to stop using the platform and go somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. You're locked into being there, or at least that's where your community is. And I think that makes sense. One of the things I think you talk about a little bit about is that people and companies, by extension, authentically want to do the right thing. But is this kind of like wanting to do the right thing and then essentially ending up being this unelected government? Is what's the path? How do you reconcile those pieces, right? How do you think about those pieces of the individuals and the companies and the governance that comes out of it?
There's sort of two ways to look at this, and I don't want to give you a 20-minute answer. So let me try to. It's the line from The Princess Bride. It's like, there's too much to say. Let me explain. No, there's too much. Let me sum up. I think that the best case way to look at it is you have communities, and communities all the way back to the beginning of digital communities. Like you can go back to the virtual community book. I think it's Douglas Rushkoff who wrote it. Amazing book about the Well and Minitel in France and early electronic communication systems in Japan, all around the world. It's the reality of any group of people are going to have conflict, are going to have people that don't want to live by the laws and the rules of the group that they're a part of, become disruptive, fall out with each other. People show up trying to hurt a community. That's inevitable. And it makes sense. You need to come up with something there. It's hard to say you're going to have an anarcho collective where everyone is off on their own and there are no rules and everything will just sort itself out. As long as we all kind of talk to each other enough, it'll all be fine. Like that is an unsatisfying solution in a lot of ways. So you need to have someone to say, well, what are the rules? How do they work? How do we help people work together? You had community managers back in the days of AOL chat groups and Usenet and so on. When these organizations started discovering that they were scaling these communities to these unbelievable levels, from hundreds to thousands to millions to tens of millions to billions of people, I think you have a reactive sense of like, oh my goodness, just having individual community managers isn't getting this done. We need to do more. Oh wait, we're now so big, it's worth criminals exploiting us in order to try to take advantage of people and steal money, or people want to steal our data. They want to do things. You have horrible people discover this is a really efficient way to share horrible images and horrible content and plan horrible things. And people are reacting in the sense of like, oh, crud, what do we do? How do we scale this up? And some of my favorite people in the world are trust and safety people, whether you call it integrity or trust and safety. These are incredibly dedicated people who are giving their lives over to trying to reduce harms, to try to make people safe, to try to make things better. But it's sort of because of that corporate framing, skipped the whole step of who should be doing this? How do we make these decisions about what's right and what's wrong? There wasn't that step of thinking through what does this imply about the community and society that we're building. And then you get the intersection of now there's an enormous amount of money in it. You have the lawyers and the business people and the policy / lobbying / PR people getting involved about, well, what's good for the business, which is not necessarily what's good for the community of humans who don't have a voice in where the decisions are going to go. And I think in aggregate, you're ending up in what feels to the people in these jobs like the best they can do, but maybe isn't the best that the communities using these platforms should get.
Yeah, I think one of the things sometimes is missing, at least in my opinion, is like pragmatism about why or who's paying the bills, what is funding the exercise, how, and so I think, again, within that framework, you can do a lot. But I think if I would sometimes hear from people at some of these companies that would say, well, some of the folks see it as their job to protect the world from the company, as opposed to, I think some of that is important to have on a team that's working on this stuff. But I think you need bits and pieces of a variety of different viewpoints. Just as I think in any kind of government or democracy, you need different viewpoints, and you need to try to be able to reconcile them with policy solutions and with the way in which you do things. So I think it's super fruitful, interesting series of topics. So how did you land on wanting to do this and spend? I love your writing, and sometimes I'm like, wow, in order to appreciate this writing, I think I have to go buy a book and like read this book that you recommend and so on. And so it's like, it's very well written, it's very well researched. And how did you land on spending your time doing this? Like, what was the process from going from what you were doing at Google through, the last couple of years and deciding to focus on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I left Google at the beginning of 2023. I actually gave notice in November of 2022 and then ended up leaving in the first big round of layoffs, sort of through mutual agreement with my manager at the time, which gave me a chance to think about what I might want to do and take a deep breath. I sort of joke, after 30 years in technology, if I was a public servant, I probably would have retired with a pension at that point. And I had an opportunity to help the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard build a new lab called the Applied Social Media Lab, thanks to a great gift from a group called Project Liberty. And I spent about a year doing that. And it was really rewarding to sort of be back to trying to make something happen, as opposed to kind of, poking the dials of a gigantic organization. I did it for a year and then realized I had hired this amazing woman named Meg Marco, who was at ProPublica and Wired and I think the Wall Street Journal, a bunch of places, and was like, she can run this place as well as better than I can. I don't need to sit here and take up space, and kind of handed it off to her. And the reason I mention this is I would say probably one of the best things that I got out of academia and that world that you don't have in corporate America is a community of people who are really interested in your ideas and want to hear new ideas and want to learn from you, learn from each other, want to explore things. And I remember in business, you would criticize a meeting by saying, oh, well, we're picking up the problem and we're looking at it from different angles and then we're putting it back down. It's like, why are we here? We're not getting anything done. Academia, large swaths of it are all about, let's pick up the problem and let's figure out what are the right words to talk about it. So I gave a talk when I was there that sort of started crystallizing what I felt had gone wrong with the world of the internet that I loved so very, very deeply, all the way back to when I discovered it in college, and was kind of pleasantly surprised to find that people were reacting to it in the sense of, hey, you might be onto something here. Somebody, I don't want to name drop, but like one very prominent professor was like, I loved your speech. I agree with every word you said. And it's like, I'm a sucker for that kind of ego feeding. And I was like, okay, then let's try it and let's see, where this is. I would also say, what's at the heart of what I'm trying to do is I am not a big believer in tearing everything down as a way to build the future. It's very easy to just talk about how terrible everything is and point out problems and laugh at people and say that this is terrible. And if we just turned everything off, we could go back and we'd be happier. There are lots of thinkers who have written books and built careers and do their own writings and give talks about how terrible everything is. That's fun and lucrative. You can do it for profit. I think what's a lot harder and more interesting to me is trying to say, given the reality of where we are and the changes that have happened and will continue to happen, what are some ideas that might help us figure out how to build forward? And that's been what's great about starting this newsletter, the research I'm doing, the things I'm trying to write about, the people I've met along the way, is starting to find people who are a little bit beyond just talking about how terrible things are and are trying to say, well, here's something that might make it better.
Yeah, I love that. And actually, this leads me to something you wrote about, I think, in the most recent post of yours about kind of decompose. You took a little bit. You kind of hinted at it when earlier in the conversation about decomposing social media into different things, into like I think you said parasocial media, social media, and social networking, and what percentage of activity is which of those. So why is that interesting? Like, tell me a little bit more about that distinction, because I was curious about if you could share more about that with everyone.
Yeah, so these are some ideas from two really great thinkers, and you should totally follow them. There's a gentleman named Ben Werdmuller, who is, I forget if he's the CTO or something. He's a leader at ProPublica, which is a great investigative journalism piece. He's built social media platforms as a founder and a CEO. He's been an investor. He writes regularly about these topics. And he did a keynote at a Feta forum back in October. And Feta forum are a bunch of people involved in the Fediverse. This is Mastodon, ActivityPub, everything around it. There's a great gathering that happens a few times a year online to share ideas. So Ben gave a talk, and he really introduced in that talk this idea that social media is the kind of consumption experience when you're sitting there flipping through TikTok or Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts, or just kind of reading stuff and doom scrolling or hope scrolling or whatever scrolling you happen to enjoy. That's a form of media, even though there's user-generated content behind it. Whereas he'd said then social networking is actually building community. And in his keynote, he gave a longer example that I couldn't reference of, hey, say you're trying to resist an unjust government action. You want to start by getting together with a very small number of people you can absolutely trust, and you need secure encryption for that. And then maybe you want to start connecting with other groups that have formed to resist this unjust government action. Maybe at a certain point you decide you want to share something out into social media, but you're building and managing a community, and you want privacy, you want methods of trust, you want to know that you've got some control. You don't want to feel like the whole thing's going to get turned off by an enormous corporation thousands of miles away from you. So he kind of did that. And then Dana Boyd, she's a legend. A great book that's might be a decade old now called It's Complicated, about the social lives of teens, is probably the best antidote I know to the alarmism that phones are destroying teenagers. It's, as her book says, it's more complicated. And she put out a piece just last week that I thought was, maybe 2 weeks ago now, that I thought was great, where she said social media is now parasocial media, pointing out that a lot of what you're experiencing in this media side of things is the simulation of community, but you're really just interacting with someone who is a creator that's at arm's length. It's sort of watching a bunch of Mr. Beast videos doesn't make you Mr. Beast's best pal. And there are people that I love, Hank Green, Patton Oswalt, this comics creator named Gail Simone. There are all these great people on Threads and Blue Sky right now. I love what they write. I laugh. They think it's clever. None of them know who I am. I don't have a real relationship with them. It's all parasocial. And what I liked about it when you kind of put these two together is going back to the notion that these communities, these corporate entities, are something new and different. They're not power utilities. They're not just the phone company. They're not just their regular corporations. Is how do you talk about what's underneath them? And I think starting to draw these distinctions of what are these different use cases, and what should governments have in terms of rules? What's our appropriate role in having a voice in what's going on, becomes maybe a more productive way to talk about it. Like when you talk about age verification and age restrictions for social media, you have to be clear about what problem are you trying to address. Is the issue algorithmic feeds that have an addictive character? Is the concern content that is inappropriate for young children being displayed to them? Is the problem the risk of adults communicating with and harming children? Is the risk children communicating with each other in harmful ways? Each of these are different and might have a different appropriate solution that isn't just, hey, let's just turn the thing off until you turn 16.
Yeah, so actually, I was going to ask you about age verification because you spent a bunch of time writing about that, and I know you have some views that some people agree with, some people don't agree with, which are the best kind of views. But as a lead into that, I met some folks in Australia who some of whom worked in government, some in technology and so on. And they were talking recently, one of them was talking to me recently about what they've learned from the social media age ban. And what they basically said, the TLDR was, they said they really hadn't heard that much negative about it. And that was part of their worry, which was that it seems like it was very quickly circumvented by the kids that cared to continue doing that. As you know, there's lots of ways to get around, using technology to get around various restrictions and so on. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your views on age verification, because I think that's a very deep and meaningful topic for all of us who've grown up on the internet, where nobody knows your insert blank, right? So,
yeah, it's a big topic, and I don't want to speak authoritatively that I know the right answer here. I would say the biggest concern I have about age verification is the notion that we are going to require every adult in the world or in a given jurisdiction to submit identity information, however securely you say you're going to do it, in order to protect a different class of people. And I think it's looked at along the lines of like, oh, well, if you want to buy alcohol, you need to show ID, or you want to buy tobacco products, you need to show ID. It's, why is this any different? And I think the difference is the pervasiveness of these platforms is something dramatically different. I was digging around a little to try to find statistics on like what percentage of people buy and drink alcohol, what percentage of people buy and use tobacco products. It's not as high as you might think relative to the number of people that are using social platforms or communicating. And so that's where I sort of start, is it's one of these things that sounds good, but then you suddenly realize you're kind of putting enormous chunks, if not the entire internet, under a kind of identity regime. And no matter how much you try to say you're doing it safely and you're doing zero knowledge proofs and stuff, you're still going to that notion that somehow you have to prove something about yourself in order to use even a part of the internet, which is a substantial part, because again, we use it for communication. That's where I start. I'll pause there before I talk about other issues.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. I think also one of the things I think a lot of folks looking at this kind of stuff don't really reckon with is the things that seem like they should work and should exist actually turn out to be hard technical problems. Like, and I worked on age verification at Facebook when we were doing political ads, and we had explained to people, well, actually, even in the countries with the best coverage, I can't be even 90% accurate on age verification. And so when you start talking about, and this is for mainly adults, now you start talking about kids, you start talking about, like, it gets very tricky. And I've also over the last couple of years talked to a lot of people implementing this kind of technology at other companies. And they're like, yeah, there's this vendor that does this thing and they claim it's this, but it's actually that. And it turns out there's a lot of things that are hard, that again, if you're working on these problems and you try to explain them to a regulator or to a litigator or to another journalist, it turns out they're like, well, of course it's in your interest to say that this is really hard. I actually do think age verification is maybe not uniquely, but certainly it's quite difficult.
Yeah, and that whole question of what's the appropriate role of governments as opposed to the communities on these platforms is an interesting one, because a lot of times the people in government that are talking about this don't use these platforms. They're not familiar with them. They're not deeply embedded in them. And that means you're being governed by representatives of the people in one way, but in another way, the actual interest of the communities on these platforms are not being represented. And I think in talking about the broad historical perspective, we really are still in a fairly early stage of human societies changing in a very deep and profound way due to the presence of the internet and internet technologies like the phone, God help us, AI. And I really harken back to things like the advent of printing in Western Europe. There's a great book called The Printing Revolution in Early Modern Europe by a woman named Elizabeth Eisenstein. There's a long version that I don't think anybody reads, and then there's like a shorter version she did, which is the version I read. It's a surprisingly readable book for a book of 500-600-year-old history. But what she talks about is how much the whole notion of society and humanity shifted once you started to have printing. It changed the whole notion of what was the role of the Christian church in Western Europe, who determined what truth was when you started to have multiple versions of the Bible going around. And then you could have scientific texts that people could learn from and build on. And I think that's a lot of what's happening with the internet is you and I are effectively immigrants to the internet. We can remember a time in our lives when we did not have the internet. And you'll understand this much better than I do because you've actually moved from one country to another in your life. I'm an American, so I don't have that. But if you think of that immigrant experience, you adapt, you learn, but you always have something else. Our children are the children of immigrants. And if you know anyone who's a child of an immigrant, is that next generation, they're still experiencing a bit of a dual culture where they're experiencing the culture of the country where they were born and where they're citizens and where they live, but they still are also experiencing the culture of their parents who came from somewhere else. It's really that next generation beyond that, our children's children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. When you've been raised by someone who can't remember a time before the iPhone, the way they're going to look at all of these problems and think about the technology, I think will be very different and hopefully either better informed or misinformed in more interesting ways to talk about what the solutions are rather than trying to apply that pre-internet framing forward and missing all of these technology challenges that you're talking about.
So I think about this kind of thing a lot in terms of how different generations think about things and their reaction to technologies. You mentioned AI, and I just think of the kids these days. They use AI more than they seem to like AI. I think we could talk about this in a lot of different ways, but one of the things you talked about printing press and the internet, and so this idea that now we have humans using tools to create things that aren't real or that are like simulate reality or deep fakes or whatever, or AI slop, I think it changes some of the dynamics of some of the social relationships and the relationship we have to content or how we consume content and in these social networks. And I'm curious how, the extent to which you've thought about that dynamic or what that changes in the model of the parasocial versus social networking framework you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm going to comment this question of sort of AI slop and things that are not real in a bit of maybe an unusual direction, which is the work that I did in my last role at Google. I was leading product management for a central counter-abuse technology team. So we were dealing with compromised devices, compromised accounts, child safety, spam in products like Gmail, all kinds of harms, exploits, and so forth. And I had already seen some of this back when I had a product management role in ads and saw a lot around ad fraud, but really got immersed in this space for the last couple of years I was at Google. And something I came away with was a very strong feeling that an enormous percentage of the harms that we think of associated with the internet come from these organizations making it trivially easy to get an anonymous account that can do pretty much anything. And you look at the spam out there, it comes from these things. You look at the pig butchering scams that I know are the kind of thing you're very concerned with these days. A lot of the misrepresentation. When people talk about misinformation and disinformation, state-sponsored disinformation is a real thing, and it comes from governments and non-governmental entities being able to get a hold of an account and pretend they're someone who they're not. And AI slop in a lot of ways is just a massive turbocharging of that gaping hole in the side of everybody's security posture. to call out one company, there were leaks that people inside Meta estimated something like 10% of Meta's ad revenue was coming from scams and fraud. And there were other leaks about the company choosing not to be more aggressive about closing some of these loopholes, which I obviously never worked there. I can't vouch that any of these leaks are accurate. Lawyers out there, please don't sue me. I'm just repeating what I have seen covered. And so I do think, to almost argue with myself on the concern about age verification and identity, we are going to need to have a conversation about how can we have more confidence that we are interacting with actual human beings when someone or something claims to be an actual human being. And actual human beings can still be terrible to each other. It's not going to create a utopia. But I think we've created a world. You were joking about the old New Yorker cartoon on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And everybody thought it was really funny. And ironically, that is actually kind of at the heart of what is tearing the internet apart. Maybe we do need to know if you're a dog. Sorry.
So it's the old freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. Is it essentially that argument, or a version of that? You probably hate that one.
I don't like that one because I can't see past, again, it's a question of, well, who's making the rules? The freedom of speech, freedom of reach is generally an excuse for saying we, the company, are allowed to decide how our algorithm works, and you just need to put up with it. And the problem is because we don't have a voice in these algorithms, we don't even have the transparency to understand what they're doing. I'm going to pick on my old boss to be funny. Neil Mohan was my boss in ads for 10 years, and he's a fantastic person. I have absolutely no idea whether the YouTube recommendation algorithm has a Mohan circuit in it, where if you want to say Neil Mohan is a blank, blank, bleepity, bleep, bleep, is that going to get downranked? I don't think it is, knowing Neil, he's a very honorable person, but that's coming down to the fact that I knew this man personally, and so can make a judgment about his trustworthiness. Someone else who's never met Neil Mohan is probably like, I have no way to have confidence that YouTube is doing this accurately or honestly, or is being a fair broker in what I see. And that's the fundamental problem. It's not, is Neil good? Is Mark bad? Is TikTok controlled by a foreign government? The issue is that we don't have any way to know or make any of those decisions. And so if we knew any of that, then we could start to have a discussion about, well, who is allowed to do what, and what do we support and what do we not support? It's, we can have the debate of maybe consumption. I would say consumption should be very, very anonymous. You should be allowed to watch Netflix or watch what you want on YouTube and not have the government know who you are or the company need to know who you are necessarily. But then maybe if you want to publish to a small number of people, that's fine. But I don't know that you should be able to publish something that could reach billions of people virally without some level of something. And even saying that, I know there are going to be civil liberties people that are howling at that. And I want to be very clear. I'm not proposing, just like you're saying, a glib, oh, yeah, we just make everybody log in before they post big things and it'll be fine. That could create all kinds of problematic censorship issues too. But that's the kind of debate we have to start having, rather than just turning it over to the platforms and yelling at them if we think they got it wrong.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. In a sense, like the ranking algorithm, folks who've been in, like you or I, who've been working in these companies, have known ranking algorithms are very important. Obviously, the public has come to realize that. I think maybe even now more so, far more so, they're far more important now. If you have the volume of content and the provenance of content, the volume has gone up, the provenance has become more sketchy in some cases. Now, essentially things can still go viral, but now you don't, we haven't caught up in other areas, like whether it's identity or other things. And so now the ranking algorithms become even more important. We have also all of these liability regimes that protect the companies from being sued or being held accountable for what goes viral or what is promoted. And so it feels like, does it feel like there's like this mismatch now in how we handle or think about algorithms as a society. Like because also many of these algorithms are they're based on millions of rows in a database. No one could really explain them without building another algorithm to explain the other model. Like it's very, again, technically tricky, but also I wouldn't want to say it feels powerless. Like we're certainly not powerless by any means. What's your take on the algorithmic side of this?
Yeah, Lawrence Lessig is a sort of famous Harvard professor and thinker that I think coined the concept that code is law, that when you are writing code or having an algorithm learn to make a set of decisions enabled by code, you are setting up the laws of that community and what works and what doesn't work. And going back to that earlier question about sort of how did we end up in these governments, I think just like the trust and safety folks are all great people doing the right thing in terms of what they have access to and power over, but in aggregate, it's problematic. I think that's the same thing with the people building the algorithms, is they are trying to achieve their objective function, which is not show people horrible things and try to show people things that are good and things that they're interested in, and probably at some point support a business goal around driving engagement or increasing usage or making more money from ads. But in aggregate, to your point, we've created something large and powerful and important that we haven't really been able to have a discussion about, and also can't really choose among or opt out of.
Well, actually, so when you think about AI and helping with content moderation, trust and safety, I'm trying to find some optimistic stuff in every conversation I have, where some of it is not optimistic. I don't think you're not optimistic, but I think, how do you see the role of AI in terms of helping to keep platforms safer, or to help, maybe take decisions out of the hands of a small group of unelected, governance folks? Like, is there some optimism or some things to point to that give you some hope on that front?
I'm very hopeful that we'll continue to see advances in personal AI, talking about on-device models, talking about technologies to help people manage their own lives in ways that feel more natural. And let's go back to the thing about child safety. Part of what makes child safety on the internet feel so difficult for parents right now, and I'm very sympathetic to it, is every platform has slightly different child safety tools, and they're in different parts of the app. And how do you set up your family, and how many separate parent accounts do you need to set up with your kid accounts to then say, what are they allowed to do? What are they not allowed to do? What age are they? How do these things work together? The classifications are very challenging. I think Roblox has, they have one classification for, I think, frequent unrealistic blood that's different from a categorization for free, what is it? It's frequent unrealistic blood versus infrequent realistic blood. And it's sort of, what does that even mean? How does a parent decide what's okay? What can my 8-year-old handle? What can my 12-year-old handle? It's messy and it's challenging. And I understand why it's overwhelming and feels fairly infeasible to keep up with it. In the real world, if you've got an 8-year-old and they say, hey, I want to ride my bike to my friend's house, you can think through all of the safety considerations and planning considerations around that in your own mind using natural language. It's like, okay, which kid, how far away is it? Does my kid reliably wear a helmet? Are they busy streets? Is it a small suburban neighborhood? Does it look like it's going to rain? What time is it now? When is dinner? And you can come back and you can tell the kid, like, no, sorry, you can't ride your bike to Bobby's house today. It's too late. Or you can go to Bobby's house, but you're not allowed to go to the candy store together, because the last time you and Bobby went there, there was a problem. Or whatever the rules are, be back by 5:00 for dinner or soccer practice or whatever. And so it's not like you have to rely on the bike company to create an update. Hey, we have provided time zone support on your Schwinn, and now everything's great. Peugeot now with a GPS chip. You don't need to rely on the provider. So the reason I think this would be interesting with AI is, if you took the spirit of these AI things and yeah, right now everybody's using it for like, please organize my calendar of professional events and help me figure out how to optimize my time. Why can't you apply that to your kids and say like, okay, here's the deal. My kid, I don't want them to see any violent content on YouTube. I don't want them to see people insulting each other playing video games because that's just not what I want. But here's the deal. They love professional soccer. They can watch any professional soccer content, even if it's some gruesome on-field injury, and even if it's people like talking smack to each other in the stands. Like that should be possible. And like YouTube has done more than probably any platform. They're like, there's YouTube Kids, there's YouTube itself. Each of them have multiple levels of control, but I can't do what I just said. I can't just tell YouTube, here's what I want my kid to see and what I want my kid not to see. And I'm very optimistic that that's the sort of thing that AI could start to enable. I could take my kid's iPad and say, make this iPad totally unavailable other than playing podcasts after bedtime on school nights. And then if it's a late opening tomorrow, I should be able to just pick it up and say, hey, iPad, this is the voice you've already verified locally with a model. This is Dad. And I'm saying add an extra hour of iPad time because it's a late school opening. I think AI would make it way easier to be a parent online.
I think that's true. I've been experimenting with getting Claude Cowork to summarize all the many emails from the kids' schools. So that's actually going better than I thought so far. We'll see how it scales. I guess this is May. It's that time of the year when there's so much stuff. Everyone's trying to finish up the school year. So
it'll come back and it'll say, I realized you were getting too many notifications about your children's things, so I decided the best thing to do is to just auto-delete half of them so that you wouldn't feel so overwhelmed.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the ideas I had, about 10 years ago was talk to someone about this, about building an Android box that would plug into your, home TV setup and would essentially, because I was like, how do you let kids watch sports, but I don't want them to see violent, ads for violent video games. And it was like kind of it wasn't really like ad blocking, but it was like block content that obviously for a lot of reasons, that doesn't make any sense. And no one's it's not a real business. But I just think there's definitely something here about these personal AIs. And again, this is like, it's not like these are novel ideas. I mean, science fiction writers like Neil Stephenson have written about this kind of stuff for years, right? But I do think we're getting to a point where you could actually implement some of this stuff, even with a bunch of tokens and a weekend. You could probably do something interesting as a proof of concept.
I think you can get there, and I think this is where you need hooks. Like there's a great trust and safety leader out there, Alice Hunsberger. She actually, her latest piece this week is about we need to standardize parental controls. And I think that's an interesting sort of idea. And this goes back to the question of age verification. Instead of spending all of this time just trying to like figure out who exactly everybody is, what if we turned that around and we said, hey, company, hey, platform, if you want to serve children, you need to take on an enhanced set of obligations because you are asking to do business and make money and serve a population that has special status in our society for a lot of really, really good reasons. And then make it the burden on them and tell them, yeah, this is like some of the recent cases that Meta and YouTube have lost for harms to children. If you want to serve kids, you have to provide highly usable parental controls that can be automated. You do need to take a different level of responsibility for moderating your content. And again, kudos to YouTube. The first version of YouTube Kids had a lot of problems, and they went back and they changed their approach in order to get more of the terrible things out of there. I'm not sure where it is right now. But like, then it's like, hey, if you don't want to incur the cost and difficulty of creating something that has an appropriate level of risk for kids, guess what? You need to then make it clear that your product is not for kids and don't let kids' devices use it. And, people will say, oh, well, that just loops back to the problem of how do you know if they're a kid or not? And it's a little bit of like, okay, well, then say, yeah, I'm only for adults, or maybe we have it on the device. And it is like, if it's your kid's phone or your kid's iPad, and recognizing not everybody has separate devices. If the account on this device has been labeled as being a kid's account, you need to do something different.
Yeah, I like that. I like that idea. It's kind of like the if you're a developer and you want to build the high-end condos, you also got to build affordable housing, right? Like, yeah, I mean, that's one variant of it. Perhaps not exactly what you were saying, but
I think it's more like it's more like if you want to open a restaurant, you have to meet the health inspection standards.
well, yeah, that goes.
If you want to open a liquor store, you are liable for making sure that you're not selling stuff to 15-year-olds.
Well, I took that as a given.
Don't want
to, I took that as a given.
Yeah, well, it is, but it's like this. It's funny. You go back to these questions of the commercial imperatives and the practicalities. What I don't accept is these platforms seem to be saying, make our products as safe as possible as long as it does not impact our spectacularly large profits. Whereas in most important industries in the world, whether it's finance or building an automobile or opening a restaurant, usually the societal standard is we want you to be as profitable as possible as long as you're meeting a baseline of safety. And we've somehow gotten away from that online. These companies we're talking about are not barely scratching by and they're worried about having to make gigantic layoffs just to keep the lights on. We're talking about some of the most profitable entities in the history of humanity who also have multi-billion-dollar war chests. They could significantly expand their investment in any of these areas: public participation, safety, transparency, more options, and still be some of the most phenomenally profitable entities in the history of humanity. And given that AI is making software development more productive, they could plow all of that money back in without doing things. I don't want to sound too glib about this, but we've lost the connection between profit and safety in this industry, I think.
100%. I mean, you and I have had this conversation a couple times about the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety and the objective standards for automobile safety, and they started doing crash testing, and again, they had a financial interest in safer vehicles, but they weren't the people making the vehicles. And so, I think you need something like that to set some objective guidelines, and then sure, be as profitable as you can be as long as you're meeting these safety guidelines or transparency or whatever it is, those things. But we're just kind of in this chicken and egg situation until people realize that we need to solve one of the sides of it. The baseline question needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would be very optimistic about, whether it's AI enabled or in general, is I think we could do a lot better on a lot of these things while still letting billionaires exist and thrive and become unbelievably rich in the future. I don't think that this is an either or situation. I think it's a question of agreeing on how do we handle all of these externalities that currently these companies are not really paying for the harms, while still giving them plenty of room to exist and be phenomenally profitable. It's sort of coming up with standards around providing electrification to rural areas did not come at the cost of utility companies all going out of business. You could still make a lot of money doing a lot of things in the world.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, this week, I think it's Google I/O, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
We had some fun discussions about that. There was some fun work that we had to do on that when we were back at Google. But if you could, whether it's at I/O or another event, you could put one question to Sundar, to Zuck, or to Elon on stage and have them actually answer you honestly, like, what would it be?
Well, the second part of your question is doing a lot of work there. The couple of times I had the opportunity to ask a pointed question of a senior executive, the main thing that I learned is that they were profoundly better at dodging hard questions than I was at asking them. I almost feel like that framing is what I would resist. Like I would almost, the question that, what I would rather do is I'd rather have the ability to sit down with one of those people behind closed doors and talk about what was actually going on and try to actually negotiate around changing the incentives on some of these things. And trying to see, can we find a new and healthier way to move forward where they can trust that this is not an uninformed elected official or bureaucrat just trying to mess up the good thing they got going, but also saying, hey, we are building something that affects the future of, our societies, our countries, our civilizations. And why be satisfied here? Why not try to do better?
I enjoy Nilay Patel's, I guess at one point on his podcast, he frames it as it's execs versus media training, or him versus the exec media training, kind of, because I think, again, they're so good at answering things in that way. But the part about me that I wish we could have, and perhaps it's not realistic, is actually have real discussions about this stuff in public or with folks who get it. Like, there's so much of this, even in our, especially in our government, that is performative question asking in front of, the nation. I'd prefer that we could figure out some way to make progress on these questions and get people in the room who perhaps a priori we would not know should be in the room to have those discussions. Because to your point about participatory governance, like there's a lot there that to unpack in who gets to participate in that discussion.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, the latest thing I've been reading has been about different models of justice systems, which I wasn't super familiar with. Like, I grew up in the US, which is very influenced by the UK common law tradition. Continental Europe has a different approach to law that comes out of literally like ancient Roman stuff. It's called civil law tradition. I'm now in the section reading about the history of Chinese law, which I hadn't known much about. And one of the distinctions in law is the difference between substantive law and procedural law, where substantive law is like, thou shalt not kill. If you steal my stuff, you have done something wrong. You can't break a contract. And then there's procedural law, which is, how are the laws made? Jury trials. What does the government have to do before they seize your property? There are laws around the procedures. And I think some of the reason these conversations with companies are not very productive is there's a lot of focus on the substantive law of, kids are being harmed. You have to stop that. There's fraud happening. Don't let there be fraud. It's all about the outcomes we want. And there's not nearly as much time that's being spent on the procedural part of it. Is, what can these companies do? Should there be a public notice period before they change their policies? Should you be entitled to due process before your account is terminated? I think the Digital Services Act in Europe has started to nod a little bit in this direction with some transparency requirements. And there is a notion of the ability to appeal certain decisions, though it's still very tilted in the company's favor, at least kind of cracks it open. To the point about having these conversations, maybe we could agree on some procedural aspects that would still give the company a fair chance to be involved and say things, but is maybe saying a little bit of like, it can't be you making this decision behind closed doors and then telling everybody ex post facto why you think you made the right decision. And critics of these companies might not get their way, but at least then there would be more of a voice.
I think that's an optimistic note for us to end with. I believe there's something there that we could figure out. I do agree with you.
Sure.
How should people find you online? Where should they go? Tell us where to go.
Absolutely. So you can subscribe to my newsletter, Platformocracy, which is a free, mostly weekly newsletter that advocates for more democracy online at www.platformocracy.com. Hope to God I spelled that right.
Yes, and we will put it in the show notes as well, and so people will get that. That'll be great. And
and you're welcome to email me directly at Jonathan, JONATHAN @platformocracy.com. Happy to hear from anybody who's listened to this, and would love to hear your thoughts and see if I can help.
That's awesome, Jonathan. Thank you so much. It was really great to catch up with you again. I always learn something when we chat, which is awesome.
Thanks, Rob.